I'm Kate. On this week's episode, I spoke to Rebecca Schot-Guppy, who's the CEO of Fintech Australia. We had a really great chat on a couple of different topics. I think the first thing to mention is we spoke a fair bit about the fintech ecosystem in Australia. Beck makes the really important point that while we're a small market, obviously a small population and still a market very dominated by the major banks, we actually have a lot of fintech cred, I could say. So we've got the likes of Afterpay, obviously, a really key fintech player, Zip, the other buy now pay later providers, also all going into other markets. So we're actually quite a good exporter of fintech, which I hadn't really thought about in that context before. And our fintech ecosystem really is maturing quite a lot. I spent some time a couple of weeks ago at the Fintech Australia conference where that was very much the key theme: collaboration between different providers in the industry, but also just that maturation of the industry. And even the fact that we're quite far along with CDR, we've taken a bit of a different approach compared to the UK. I think that all points to the fact that there's a lot we can learn globally from what's happening in the Australian fintech market at the moment.
I think it's a really interesting space because there's a lot of rapid change as well, and we're seeing more and more new propositions being available on the market. And I think open banking is a space where there's so much scope to actually make consumers' lives a lot easier with their banking and make it easier for them to understand their own money and how they spend and who they have products with and cancel products if they want to or open new ones. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity. And I think that fintech is going to play such a key role, and Fintech Australia is quite key to that, given they have all these relationships and they're really across what's happening. So it's going to be a good episode to learn more about what's happening in Australia, but also what the scope is globally for these fintechs to make impact and grow and really help consumers as well.
Yeah, and I think the fact that CDR in Australia is actually quite far-reaching compared to what's maybe a bit more of a narrow approach in the UK. So as you said, open banking can really solve customer pain points, and I think Australia is going to be a really good example of how that could work and what propositions will work well in other markets. I know other markets are starting to look to Australia on the open banking front already. And then the other topic that Beck and I discussed was the importance and the role of having female leadership. Financial services is obviously quite a male-dominated industry, as is technology. Fintech, by nature of that, is very male-dominated. There's lots of male founders, not a lot of female founders. But just the importance of having not just female voices, but having diverse voices at leadership levels in product meetings, making sure that there's a diversity of opinion and thought that's going into how these products are created. And I think some of what we've spoken about in the podcast before, solving quite specific issues for different groups of people, you really do need that diversity of opinion to make sure that you're not just creating a product that really only suits one type of customer, or maybe doesn't go far enough in solving those big problems that we've been talking about, like financial inclusion.
Yeah, I think when thinking about what the problems are, you really need to have people in the room when making these decisions who experience different things. So whether it's someone who doesn't speak English as a first language, or who has their role at the moment is home duties or caring for the kids, thinking about who are these voices and how can they be included in decision making. Otherwise, the product that you're making isn't suitable for the whole market. It's only suitable for a key segment of the market. And I think that's something that both of us are really interested in learning more about. And fintech has a lot of scope to actually address financial inclusion and digital inclusion as well, which is broad inclusion generally. And I think that's where fintech has quite an important role to play as well.
Absolutely. Even the fact that the way men and women approach their banking and their finances and debt is quite different, or investing is quite different. So women are more debt averse. Women aren't as likely to go into investments and do things like invest in shares. So all of that actually becomes really important when you're starting to think about not just how do we make sure people have access to banking products, but how do we make sure they have access to the products that are right for them, that suit their needs, that progress not just financial inclusion, but I guess financial well-being.
Absolutely. And even, making customers' lives a little bit easier, and then more holistically, how can you make banking more inclusive in general products and services as well, whether it's investing or everyday banking or lending or other forms of other products as well.
Let's get into the interview. Hi, Beck. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background prior to joining Fintech Australia?
For those that don't know me, my name is Rebecca Schot-Guppy and I'm the CEO of Fintech Australia. Prior to joining Fintech Australia, I worked as both a corporate lawyer at Hall & Wilcox and then the head of community at Stone & Chalk. And in my spare time, I like keeping active, following sport and cooking good food and drinking red wine.
Sounds good. Why don't you tell us a bit about Fintech Australia and what you do there?
So Fintech Australia is the peak industry body and we represent over 300 Australian fintechs. We were founded over 5 years ago. We're most known for our policy and advocacy work and being the voice of the fintech ecosystem. The other things that we do are we help our members grow, whether that's connecting them with our corporate partners, each other, or helping them scale overseas. And then we run 2 flagship events, being Intersect and the Finnies.
Yeah, and Intersect was recently. It was a great conference.
Yeah, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. I think that there was just a buzz in the air with everyone coming together and connecting. We're so lucky to have been able to have it. As you know, Kate, it was in Melbourne only 2 weeks ago and the city was in lockdown a week later. So we're very lucky to have it. And I think Intersect represented a whole new maturity of the sector.
Yeah, completely agree. That was my sort of takeaway from the conference as well, just how much the sector has grown and also just so nice to be in person with everyone.
Yeah, I think everyone's talking about the networking and how much they miss in-person networking versus via Zoom.
Absolutely. What was it that made you decide to start working in fintech, coming from sort of that law background? What is it that you like about your current role?
So what I love about it is that every day is different. I think I love the fact that it's high energy and fast moving. I had a bit of a weird transition. I thought I wanted to work in VC and maybe I still do, but I didn't do investment banking. So I'd miss out on roles just because of that. And so I had the opportunity to take the head of community role at Stone & Chalk, which really opened my eyes to fintech, insurtech and regtech, which led me down a pathway of really using both the legal skills that I learned at Hall & Wilcox in terms of, drafting legislation, policy. So I think Fintech Australia is a perfect role because I get to both do the community work that I loved at Stone & Chalk, but do some policy and advocacy, which brings into part my legal skills.
And as you said, Fintech Australia very involved in that policy work and advocacy for the sector. Why do you think it's important that we have a really strong fintech sector in Australia?
I think it's really important that we have a strong fintech sector in Australia because it is the future of the economy. I think more importantly, I think every nation is looking at that tech-led post-pandemic, but more importantly, we have the opportunity, given that we have such a financial services strength, to really lead in such a space. And we're seeing that in payments and open banking at the moment.
Yeah, and as you alluded to there, the fintech industry, the digital, going to be really important post-pandemic. What are the key impacts that 2020 did have on the fintech sector in Australia? Have they largely been positive or negative? What are the key challenges facing the industry?
I think, it was really a tale of 2 different stories. And, we saw the biggest fintechs get bigger and we saw some Australian fintechs through the pandemic have the opportunity to scale. And we obviously saw indebted land in the UK and the US, and we saw Afterpay, Zip, Athena, Wiser up all go from strength to strength, really, that digital banking. We also saw payments change, and a really basic example of that is Tap and Go went from 100 to 200. But then we had some other fintechs that really struggled for traction or, more importantly, capital, given that, there was a big capital squeeze, particularly from risk-adverse investors, particularly in the first 2 quarters of the pandemic. So, some companies really flourished and others, unfortunately struggled. But I think overall, it's been a positive. There's been a positive growth from fintech from the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think the other question I'd be really keen to get your thoughts on is just the differences between the Australian fintech industry and the industry in other markets. Obviously a much smaller market in Australia compared to the UK or the US, but what do you see as the biggest differences or maybe the biggest challenges facing fintechs in Australia compared to other markets?
Well, first of all, I would like to just point out that I think that we bat above our average in terms of fintechs. Like we have Afterpay, Airwallex, Judo, that are all unicorns, and we're continuing to see Australian companies scale into different markets. So Assembly with Standard Charter. So I do think we punch above our weight in terms of fintechs compared to other markets. But the challenge is that capital piece. We talk about that quite often. That the capital flows, particularly in that Series C and Series D, are much harder. So we see Australian fintechs have to go offshore to get capital. Now, while that can be a tactical piece, because if you get capital offshore, it will help you expand into those markets. It's still probably the hardest thing for Australian fintechs, and also our population size. So you have to tap out at some point. So, you have to look at other markets if you really want to scale to a certain extent.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fact that we do bat above our weight. The Afterpay, the Afterpay story is probably a key one in terms of what other markets might be looking at coming out of Australia. What do you think other markets can learn from the Australian fintech industry and our experience in the fintech environment?
Well, certainly buy now, pay later, what you touched on, we are world class in that. I think we've been very loud in advocating for the fact that they're self-regulating, similar to the business lending with their code and that self-regulation to allow for innovation. I think, other industries and ecosystems can learn from our more broad consumer data right. Well, it hasn't been fully rolled out yet, and obviously there's a long way to go even in open banking, but the fact that it's going to be economy-wide consumer data right rather than just banking, I think that's something that other ecosystems can learn from us. And obviously we're really strong in payments. So our e-commerce payments, I don't know, Square's a global company, but looking how Square transitioned to e-commerce during the pandemic, our QR codes, our payment gateways are all first class.
Yeah, and I think to that point, Australians are also just really good at adopting new payment technology. Afterpay, an obvious example, but also just contactless. We've had really high rates of contactless adoption in Australia for a number of years. Mobile payments have taken off here, and e-commerce, as you said, as well.
Well, a really great example of that, even on a really basic level, is one of my friends who's a doctor today said, even my Garmin can do, touch payments. And I was like, would never have thought you even thought about that. But yeah.
Yeah, even my 60-year-old mum is using mobile payments.
Yeah, so it's mine. But my favorite is when my mum told me about Osco that allows you to send money in real time. And I was like, well, Mum, that's the new fast payments rail. And she was shocked that she finally understood what I did. Some part of what I did was she could send money in real time.
There you go. The other topic I want to talk to you a little bit about is about the role of women in, I guess, financial services and in technology, both industries and fintech, I guess, too, both industries where women have generally been underrepresented historically. How important do you think it is to have that representation, and how does that play into us having a strong, I guess, not just fintech economy, but a really strong financial services industry in Australia?
Yeah. Well, to be honest, Kate, in the fintech industry, we have a long way to go. I think the stats are 19% female founders versus 80% male, and I think that's gone up post-pandemic. And I wrote a bit of commentary 2 years ago in the EY Fintech Australia census about this, and I think it all stems from FS, right? And until we change, one, the fact that there's a gender pay gap, and in FS that means the men have more financial security. Women are risk adverse. The job security at being at a financial services compared to a fintech. And then obviously we can't change the nature of, maternity leave and all those kinds of things. So, once we switch the dialogue on these things, we may be able to get more women into fintechs. But I think, fundamentally we need to also change the gender pay gap at FS and have more women in leadership roles to enable them to then take the risk and start a fintech. But it's so important to have women not only as founders, but as part of an early stage team. It's just studies show that fintechs and tech companies that have women at senior leadership do not only better in relation to scaling, but better in relation to capital raising and their journey. And I think that everyone knows that a diverse team creates better outcomes. And so I think it's really important to have women at all levels of your business.
Couldn't agree more. I was going to ask you what the key barriers female founders face, but I think you've touched on that. Is there anything that you can point to that you think really needs to change, or something that would be relatively easy for us to change to make sure that we do have that representation?
One of the things that is probably not one of the barriers that I touched on, but the data shows that female founders don't get capital as easily as male founders do. So some of the things that the government at not only state levels but federal levels are looking at are like women only funds. So can we make sure that women founded businesses get access to funding when in an environment that has not so been supportive of them before? So some of those things can really help.
Yeah, definitely. And then as a leader in a relatively male-dominated industry within fintech, what are the most important lessons you've learned throughout your career? And what advice would you give to other women who are looking to get into, fintech or sort of more male-dominated industries in general?
One is probably know your stuff. You've got to be really confident that you know how to deliver a message or argue your point. So know your stuff. But also for me, it was taking a risk. Like I took a risk to take this job, and it's paid off in spades. And just because it's a male dominated industry doesn't mean you have less respect. You've just got to be able to hold your own in certain conversations. So make sure that you have confidence as well.
Definitely. And what are key lessons that you've learned throughout your career that you would sort of talk to around improving the gender gap?
Key lessons are probably, when you're hiring, make sure you do some non-biased hiring, and also when you're looking at your team, make sure you look at the makeup of it, where not only from a women's perspective but culturally perspective, because I think culturally diverse teams also get better outcomes. Lessons I've learned, back yourself. It's very common knowledge that men will go for a job if they tick 7 out of 10 boxes, but women only go for the job if they tick 10 out of 10 boxes. So we kind of need to switch that thinking. The other thing I've learned is be confident in relation to pay. So women go in and ask for a pay rise because they've done A, B, and C. And then the boss will say, well, they haven't done E, F, and G. But, men go in and ask for a pay rise and say that they're going to leave without it. So, not switching to be thinking like a man, but switching to think a little bit differently for when we ask for something or we have an issue that we need to raise. Sometimes just be a little bit stronger and more confident.
The other point that you made there, I thought was a really good one, is around having culturally diverse teams, gender diverse teams, really creating better products and services. Could you expand a little bit on that in terms of how you think having great female leaders, female founders within fintech, how does that influence the end customer who's using their product?
Well, I think when we think about things, everyone thinks differently. So not only females, but different cultures. So when you're in a strategy meeting, because everyone has different thinkings, you may market differently based on how someone else perceives something versus you. You may communicate with a different voice based on someone in your team if you have a diverse team. And I think that there's just so many different angles of feedback that you have if you have a diverse team, whereas if everyone thinks the same way, has had the same upbringing, or had the same university experience, you just don't get that diversity in thinking or even that diversity in feedback. And we watch that when you're with a lot of your friends and you've been to school or you've been to uni together. A lot of you often have very similar views about things, and well, that's great in your friendship circle. It's not necessarily great for product development or marketing, because you actually do need that broad brush thinking.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I've learned working in market research is while you might think everybody has the same opinion as me or everyone has the same needs as me, people are very diverse. And yeah, to your point, the more people you have making decisions who are aware of that and thinking along those lines makes a big impact on the end product and the experience for a customer as well.
Yeah, I think you'd see it all the time, right?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Just to wrap up, can you tell us a little bit about what Fintech Australia is going to be up to over the next 12 to 18 months? Is there anything you can share about what you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, so we're working on a new digital content strategy. So some of that we kicked off last year in relation to doing some segments with Startup Daily on AusBiz, and we'll be relaunching a new podcast. We recently had Austrade sign a huge MOU with us, and a part of that is we will have one of their global engagement managers embedded in Fintech Australia. So we will be part of the service to help Australian fintechs scale overseas. We've obviously had to push back the Finnies, which is very disappointing. And then obviously we've got the third issues paper to the Senate Committee on Fintech and RegTech, and we'll continue to push a lot of CDR because there's a lot of things at the moment going on in that space.
Lots going on in general, sounds like.
Yeah, never a dull day at Fintech Australia, as Lisa would tell you.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great having a chat with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Global Digital Banker podcast. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, and Podbean.